All right, are you ready to find out what else happens in No Talking? I feel like it's been a while since we've read it. So remember, the kids were still kind of doing their thing, but the teachers were kind of like, this really isn't so bad, like not having them be so crazy. So, yeah, there were some interesting things that happened. I'm trying to think. I'm not going to bother. Um, not going to bother, but it says there was one gigantic problem with all this harmony and order and balance and peace that was blooming in the fifth grade hall. Mrs. Hyatt wasn't in the loop. She was clueless about these new developments. In fact, the principal wasn't even in the building during the morning. She was across town at the district offices working on next year's budget. She had left her trusty teachers to carry out her strict orders, but Mrs. Hyatt had organized her meetings to be sure that she would be back at her school in time for fifth grade lunch, because the principal felt sure she would be needed at lunch with her bullhorn to keep law and order just like always. Because Mrs. Hyatt had complete confidence in her teachers. She was sure that by lunchtime everything would be back to normal. So then, Chapter 18, Adventures in the Red Zone. Mrs. Hyatt got back to her school at 11:59. There were several messages on her desk, and Mrs. Overby had taped a note on her chair that read, "Please come see me in the teacher's room." But the principal was in a hurry. She needed to be on time for fifth grade lunch. 5 minutes later, for the second day in a row, Mrs. Hyatt found herself standing in the middle of a silent cafeteria, holding a big red plastic bullhorn. But today it was different. She looked around the quiet room, and the sight of all these fifth graders deliberately disobeying her, well, it nudged her over the edge. It pushed her right into the red zone. She gritted her teeth, and an angry haze filled her mind. And she knew she was angry, and she knew it wasn't good to be angry, but she was. And she knew it wasn't good to be angry and try to talk to children at the same time. But she couldn't help herself. She had to talk to these kids right now. She could have whispered, and every fifth grader would have heard her. But she didn't whisper. She pulled the trigger on the bullhorn. "Have you forgotten our assembly this morning?" The principal's voice echoed off the walls. The kids stared at her. She aimed the bullhorn at Dave and yelled, "David Packer, answer me! Do you remember what I told all of you this morning?" When Dave nodded his head, she yelled, "Answer me with your voice out loud!" So Dave swallowed his first bite of macaroni and cheese and said, "I remember." His voice sounded very small. Dave felt like he was the scarecrow talking to the great and powerful Oz. Mrs. Hyatt took 5 steps closer to Dave and shouted, "Then why aren't you talking with your friends?" Dave had never seen Mrs. Hyatt this mad before, and no one had ever yelled at him with a bullhorn. It seemed unfair to be yelled at with that giant voice, so he decided he wasn't going to be afraid or angry, no matter what. Dave shrugged and said, "Nothing to say," which was perfectly true. Before Mrs. Hyatt had started yelling, he had been very happy to just sit and eat and think. "Stand up!" Dave stood up. Every kid in the room was watching him, and so was Mrs. Marlowe, and the custodian, and the cafeteria workers. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Talk! I want you to talk right now. I want to hear you tell Todd everything you learned in all your classes this morning. Start talking to Todd now." Dave wasn't an angry sort of kid. Not usually. In fact, there was only one thing that nudged him over the edge: being bullied. The only time he'd ever gotten into a fight at school was back in second grade, when a fifth grader had started picking on him. That's when Dave had learned that you can't just go along with a bully, because then you get bullied more and more. And that's how Dave felt right now. He was getting mad. It felt like Mrs. Hyatt was being a bully with a bullhorn. Again, the principal yelled, "Talk!" And that did it. It was Dave's turn for a trip to the red zone. He glared at Mrs. Hyatt and he shouted, "I do not have to talk now if I don't want to. This is our lunchtime. None of us have to talk." And a sentence flashed into Dave's mind something he had heard dozens of times on TV shows. This sentence was usually being said to criminals wearing handcuffs, but that didn't seem to matter at the moment. Dave looked around the cafeteria at his classmates and he shouted, "You have the right to remain silent." And with that, Dave pressed his lips together, folded his arms across his chest, and sat down. Lindsay was the first to pick up on Dave's body language. She looked at Mrs. Hyatt and slowly folded her arms. All the girls at her lunch table did the same, and the gesture spread through the room like ripples on a pond. Every kid stared at the principal, arms folded and stone silent. Mrs. Hyatt looked around slowly, drew herself up to her full height, and then walked briskly out of the room. She walked down the hall to the school office. She nodded at Mrs. Chaplin, the school secretary, and said, "Hold my calls." Then she went into her office, her own office, and closed the door. Back in the cafeteria, it was dead calm. Every kid sat motionless, arms still folded, not sure what to do next. Todd started it. He unfolded his arms and nodded at Dave, and then he clapped his hands. In 3 seconds, every fifth grade boy was clapping like mad. Dave looked around at his friends and smiled and nodded. And a second later, guess who joined in? That's right, all the girls. And 5 seconds later, the hooting and the whooping began. It was loud in that cafeteria. It was incredibly loud. The clapping and cheering was so loud that the sound went right through the cafeteria doors and walls and thundered down the hall all the way to the school office and right through the closed door of Mrs. Abigail Hyatt, principal. The phone on Mrs. Chaplin's desk buzzed. An intercom call. "Yes," she answered. The secretary listened, nodded, and said, "Right away." She got up and walked out of the office and down the hall and into the cafeteria, where it had gotten quiet again. Excuse me. Mrs. Marlowe was standing near the doorway, and Mrs. Chaplin whispered something to her. Mrs. Marlowe nodded and quickly walked halfway across the room. She bent down close to Dave Packer's ear and said, "To the office." Dave swallowed his third bite of macaroni and cheese and looked up into the science teacher's face. "I have to?" She nodded. "Principal's orders." Dave looked around the table at his friends. No one needed to speak a word. Their faces said it all. And the message? 3 simple words, and Dave believed them. "You are dead." Chapter 19, Apologies. There were 227 green tile squares on the hallway floor between the cafeteria and the school office. Dave counted each one to keep from thinking about what was going to happen next, but he thought about it anyway. Mrs. Chaplin pointed at the principal's door. "Go right in." Dave knocked. He knew he didn't have to, but it bought him another 2 seconds of delay. Mrs. Hyatt said, "Come in." And Dave thought, at least she's not using her bullhorn. He opened the door, and she was standing with her back to him, looking out the windows into the school courtyard. Dave blurted out, "I'm sorry." And he said that because he knew he shouldn't have yelled at the principal, even if he had been right, which he still believed he was. He also apologized because he hoped it might help save his life. Mrs. Hyatt turned around, and Dave was shocked to see the look on her face. Because she wasn't mad. She almost looked like she'd been crying, and her nose was pink. She shook her head. "That's why I sent for you, so I could say that. I'm the one who got angry, and I yelled first, and I set a terrible example, so I hope you'll forgive me." Dave couldn't remember the last time a grown-up had apologized to him, and to have the principal saying she was sorry, well, he could barely manage a nod at her. She nodded back and then paused and said, "So what are we going to do about this situation?" Not sure," Dave said. She frowned. "Please, you can talk freely in here. None of your friends can hear us." Dave shook his head. "Honor system." Mrs. Hyatt's eyebrows went up. "Oh, of course. Very admirable. Well, maybe you can answer some questions for me just to get started." Dave said, "Sure. First of all, how did all this get going? Who started it?" Dave smiled. "Mahatma Gandhi." "Pardon me?" said Mrs. Hyatt. Dave said, "He stopped talking." The principal said, "And someone wanted to try that here at school, right? Dave nodded and pointed at himself. All my fault. I see, she said. How did you learn about Gandhi? He said, social studies report. And why did he stop talking? Dave shrugged. To think more. But you're not keeping silent. Not totally. Why? Dave thought a moment and then said, respect for school, which he knew was going to make him sound like a goody-goody. But it was true. He and his friends weren't trying to shut down the school, not at all. Mrs. Hyatt nodded slowly and said, oh. She seemed to be out of questions, and during that 3 or 4 seconds of silence, an idea jumped into Dave's mind, but he pushed it out. It was too outrageous. But the idea bounced back into his head, and this time Dave just blurted it out. Want to join? Mrs. Hyatt bunched her eyebrows together. What do you mean? Join. Stop talking. She looked at Dave as if he had just told her to put on a grass skirt and dance the hula on the roof of a school bus. Don't be silly. I'm the principal. Do you have any idea how many people I have to speak to every single day? Dave pointed at a notepad on her desk. May I? She nodded and he wrote, you can say only 3 words in a row, and only if a teacher or a grown-up talks to you first. Except you can talk to a kid first, because you're sort of a teacher, and no talking at all outside of school, honor system. And the whole thing's almost over anyway, just until tomorrow. Then Dave smiled up at her and said, it's interesting. Mrs. Hyatt shook her head. I could never. Dave put up his hand like a traffic officer. There, stop. 3. Mrs. Hyatt smiled, and it wasn't a principal smile. Dave could tell she was smiling a real person smile. She smiled because she realized Dave had offered her something important. Just 5 minutes earlier, she had acted like a monster, but she wasn't, not really. Still, she had behaved terribly. Everybody in the cafeteria knew that, grown-ups and kids, both. And news like that spreads quickly. So somehow she needed to remind everyone that she wasn't a monster, fast. And Dave had just offered her a way to become human again, because it's a well-known fact that monsters do not have a sense of humor. She tore Dave's sheet off the notepad, bent over the desk, and did some writing of her own. She stepped quickly into the office and handed Mrs. Chaplin the paper. The secretary read it over quickly and said, and I should... The principal held up 1 finger and said, type. Then she held up 2 fingers and said, duplicate. And then she held up 3 fingers and said, distribute. And Mrs. Chaplin said, got it. Then, turning to Dave, the principal said, ready, set, go. Dave's head was spinning, but he managed to say, where? She was already out the office door, and over her shoulder, Mrs. Hyatt said, to the cafeteria. Chapter 20, The Winners. I was going to try to do it because it's a short chapter, but it's getting too long on the video, so we're going to have to wait and save it until tomorrow. So we'll find out tomorrow, the winners. All right, I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you later. See you, love you, bye.